Hello, Michelle Hungerford.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and good to be able to have a talk with you about your exhibition, which is called The Change. It's at the New England Regional Art Museum in Armidale in New South Wales. The Change, is that about change in the landscape?
I guess it is. It could be, it has a lot of interpretations, a bit like painting, really. I came upon it, yes, thinking about climate change and the dramatic kinds of climate we've been experiencing in the last 2 years. So yes, the change sort of does relate to all of that.
So can you share with people where it is that you're based, where you live and the region that you're in yourself, and how that landscape and that region has been affected by the climate?
I live in Tamworth in New South Wales. It's about 3 hours from the coast inland. It's a town with a population of about 60,000. I guess we're about halfway through Sydney, halfway between Sydney and Brisbane on the New England Highway.
So how has that region been affected by change? What's been happening for you in terms of what you've been having to deal with and your region's had to deal with?
Well, we experienced a very long and tedious drought. We didn't get very good rain for nearly 2.5 years, and the landscape was just looking really bad. All our water reservoirs were down, like a lot of the country, a lot of what New South Wales, Queensland had experienced. And it just, yes, I think it had a big impact on a lot of the paintings I did, especially the paintings that began in 2019.
When you say it had a big impact, tell us actually how it showed itself in your paintings. How did that impact manifest?
We live out of town, about, not far out of town, but, you know, we really have probably about 9 acres, but we just have bush all around us. And so every day you notice the changes. And my studio is sort of right on the edge of our property, and I look up into the hills, and as I watch the drought grow and the water tanks, the levels go down, the trees dying, no grass, it just started to look really desperate. And I just think it has a big emotional toll when you don't know when rain's going to come.
Let's have a look at some of the specific works in the exhibition at the New England Regional Art Museum. And the haze series, first of all, talking about changes in the landscape and the environment. In this case, it's the haze in the air. What's going on in the haze series? There are several works.
There are several works. Well, as most of New South Wales experienced as well, we had months and months of smoke haze, and Tamworth was the same due to bushfires that came at the end of summer, and it just impacted on every day. You'd wake up and another smoky day, and if it wasn't smoke, it was dust. We experienced quite a lot of dust storms, so you never quite knew. You'd have to sniff the air to see whether it was actually dust or smoke. And the landscape took on a whole different look. You know, its forms and shapes became muted, and I think that's what I was painting, you know, that kind of those moments of muted landscape. So sorry.
I was just going to say it's quite interesting looking at a couple of the different works. Haze 1, for example, you know, it looks very very dark and burnt, and there's lots of very dark charcoal coloration in that. Haze 3, signs of green, perhaps, or at least some creeping into the work there. And I should mention, as I'm referring to particular works, it's great if people who are viewing our conversation can also be having a look at the website of the exhibition at the same time, so we can talk about works and you know, the viewers can actually have a look at them. That sense of different landscapes, were the Haze series painted in quite different parts of your region?
Yes, the first one you mentioned, Haze 1, that began actually when I was on a residency in New Zealand. And the haze that I was experiencing there was a snowstorm. And as you know, the landscapes there are very dramatic. And I just started that painting and finished it only at the beginning of the year, really. And it took on not only that sense of place, but it took on something else of what I was experiencing at home. And that's quite common for me, that I will somehow have part of home in there. So, you know, it's a combination of smoke and whatever's just the drama of the haze over the landscape.
What would you say in your works is your relationship to the landscape? They don't appear to be literal works, but they're not entirely abstracted. How do you decide what elements of the landscape you actually try to portray in the works?
Well, it's funny, Richard, obviously it's not based in realism. Sometimes, and mostly, I work in the studio and rely on my imagination and my memory of moments of landscapes. But I also go into the landscape and I paint directly from the landscape. And it's just the process of painting, and it's, I don't really fully comprehend it. And I know that a lot of artists feel the same, that there's just a moment during the process where it starts to tell you its story and you just go with it. And you just have to have a lot of trust that at some point, you know, that will reveal itself. And I didn't set out to make a whole series of haze, but it just turned out that way. And that's why, I mean, they're all different formats and shapes and colours, and yeah, so
it does look as though you set out to make a whole series of forest works, though, because there are forest shadows, forest verticals, even forest bathing. Certainly suggests a very different relationship with forest somewhere not near you. Did you travel somewhere different for those works?
Well, last year I was lucky to go. I travelled quite a bit, and lucky I did, because we're not going anywhere right at the moment for some time. So yes, I was fortunate to also do a residency in the Kangaroo Valley, and it was October 2019, and it was unbelievable. It was such an antidote to what I'd been experiencing in Tamworth. You know, we were dry, we're in the middle of the drought, it hadn't rained, and the whole place looked terrible. And I go to the Kangaroo Valley, and suddenly, you know, it's this enhanced green landscape, and yes, it was very evocative. And I actually got a lot of work from that time. Not all of them are plein air. Some of them started out as plein air, but others sort of, you know, just I use the elements in the landscape as tools, I guess, as part of the process to build a picture, or, you know, try and get that moment that I'm trying to recall or describe. Yeah.
And let's go to some of the materials that you use in that process as well, because I noticed that some of the works are painted on aluminium and others on canvas or on cloth board of one sort or another. How do you decide physically how you're going to start approaching a painting, and why such different materials?
Well, last year I started experimenting with the aluminium composite board. I quite like a flat support. I do like all those surfaces. I mean, that's why I do paint on a range of things. Often it's just what's at hand at the time, but the aluminium composite board, that's right. The aluminium composite board was introduced to me by someone who I went on a residency with, and he lives up in sort of a tropical area of Australia, and was saying how the aluminium composite board's, you know, exceptional because it doesn't move with the change in temperature, or it's not affected by moisture, etc. So I thought, I'd been having a bit of trouble with twisting of my frames and that sort of thing with the high temperatures we'd experienced over summer and the dryness in our area. So I thought I'd give the aluminium composite board a go, and it's quite really a nice thing to paint on. A lot of sign writers have used it in the past, but it's you have to prepare the surface to your liking. It's quite shiny when you buy it, and then you prepare it to how you like, and away you go. But yeah, it's quite a fun thing to paint on. But the only trouble is once you get to a certain size, it gets fairly heavy. So
Yeah,
then you change up canvas.
It's certainly quite a high-tech material, but at the other end of the tech spectrum, you know, being out in the bush or out in the desert, where I know you've also visited Central Australia and done a fair bit of plein air painting. How do you approach plein air painting when you are just there with canvases or even sheets of paper? How do you approach plein air painting?
Well, it's just taking in the place that you're in, and I just take a whole range of gear. I'm not big on drawing. I don't generally keep a journal. I'm pretty hopeless at that. But I just directly paint from what I see, and then at some point I switch off from what I'm seeing and I make it my own. But I do find being out at plein air painting so valuable. It just gives you more tools for your toolbox later on. You know, you remember the moments, or something happens when you're in your studio where, you know, parts of that memory come back. And yeah, so plein air painting's so great. That's basically
so going back now to the theme of the exhibition, that of the change, you do seem to have in a couple of works some very explicit environmental concerns. I mean, there have been the ones that you've mentioned already, but there's a couple of works, death of a landscape, desertification. You know, these are addressing very
cheery little numbers.
Cheery little numbers. I mean, a lot of visual energy, but also a lot of concern about what's happening. Can you talk about both those works just a little?
Yes. Well, Heat and Death of a Landscape were just two little paintings that popped out. We also have a second property that was the family property in the Blue Mountains, and over the Christmas, well, just before Christmas, our property was impacted by fire, the Gosper fires, and my husband and two sons saved our house from going up in smoke, and we back onto the national park there, the Wallamai National Park. And you know, it's just horrific to see, you know, what that fire did, and you know, the amount of kilometres and hectares of bush that was burnt out. So yes, I felt quite strongly after that, seeing the images of the actual fire that my husband and sons had taken photos. And then I went down 2 days after the fire, and I was there for spot fires. And actually when Bilpin was then impacted, and to be there at the height of those fires, yes, it has quite an effect. And heat is a painting that I guess you could interpret it as the heat of the drought or heat of the fire. You know, they're a similar thing. They have both a destruction on the environment. So yes, it's a pretty hot palette, that one. Very sort of simple structure, but it gets its message across.
Well, I think that process of getting the message across is very powerful in these works. But when people do, as I hope they will, go to the website and look at the images, if they're not already looking at them as we're speaking, they will also see that they are very beautiful paintings, as well as carrying that message. Do you have a sense, as you're creating, of trying to get the balance of the two things, the aesthetic and the power of the message?
I guess that's the irony of it, in a way, that destruction has its own beauty. I noticed during the drought, as the bush dried off, the light on the dried trees and the leaves, it all has a different look about it, and it has a beauty, a sad beauty. And the same with the burnt out bush. You start to see the structures through the burnt trees, things that you weren't able to see before. And so, yes, there's that double whammy. You know, you're seeing the devastation, but you're also seeing the beauty in it as well, the fragile beauty of it. So I hope that does come across.
Well, they're all there in your exhibition. And Michelle Hungerford, thanks for sharing your exhibition with us.
Oh, thanks so much, Richard. It's a wonderful thing you're doing. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Cheers.